morning. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you all for your ongoing support. For those of you who are new to the Council Town Hall, we are a nonprofit 501c3 with the mission of informing our members and audiences about the most compelling international, national, and regional issues. We are a nonpartisan organization, and a very important part of our programs is that we enable our audiences to submit questions to the speakers so that we can foster a more engaged discussion. When we had the COVID hit, just like it did with you in early March, we pivoted quickly from our in-person events to these live stream webinars, which we're providing free of charge as a public service, which is why we need your help to continue to produce these quality programs. So please take just 1 minute at the end of this program to find out how you can continue to support these terrific programs like today. Thank you. It is now my great pleasure to introduce today's program, Redefining National Security for the Post-Pandemic World, with, I'm so excited, Anne Marie Slaughter, CEO of New America, moderated by Robert Abernethy, Chairman of the American Standard Development Company. Bob is a 50-year member of the World Affairs Council and Town Hall, and also a member of our board of directors. And we so appreciate his leadership and advocacy for our organization. As I mentioned, questions are a key part of our programs. You can type them in at any time. We'll be taking your questions in about 20 minutes. There's a control panel on the right-hand side where you can submit them. And Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will manage your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program. She always tries to get to as many of your programs as possible. So now, Anne Marie and Bob, it's time to bring you on the screen and get this exciting discussion going.
Thank you, Kim. I'd like to express my gratitude for the wonderful work that you are doing in leading the Los Angeles World Affairs Council Town Hall. Your performance has just been marvelous, and all of us who are members, particularly those of us who are longtime members, are very grateful for the leadership that you've been demonstrating and the types of programming that you've been able to produce for all of us to partake of.
Thank you.
Anne Marie, welcome.
Thank you.
You have a very long and distinguished career. You started out in Princeton, getting your bachelor's degree there, then went across the Atlantic to Oxford to get your master's, and then back across the Atlantic to Harvard Law. And after having finished there as a distinguished student, you went back across the Atlantic again to Oxford to get a doctorate in philosophy and international relations, and you've taught at Princeton and Harvard. You've been in Washington, D.C., the Director of Policy and Planning, the U.S. State Department, and now you're in a Washington-based organization, the President and CEO of New America. We want to talk a little bit about diversity on this program, and you have constrained your life on the west by the Mississippi River and on the east by the Danube. And talking today to a wonderful group of Californians, and we are a representative of a greater West in the United States with a wonderful set of academic institutions and foundations and groups of people that are very interested in international relations all around the globe, with perhaps a bit of an emphasis on Canada and Mexico and Latin America and maybe the Western Pacific. We are a huge port, LA and Long Beach, combined together and produce much of the trade that goes to the Western Pacific. So why is it that you limited yourself to not going west of the Mississippi? And what can you do about that in the next couple of years to begin to try to diversify that experience to include some of the wonderful things in the West?
So Bob, first of all, it's great to see you. And Kim, thank you for the introduction and for your leadership. I should really begin by saying how pleased I am to be back at the LA World Affairs Council. I have talked to some subset of your members several times over the years, and it's always been a great conversation. So I was really happy to be able to do this. I think, Bob, what you're getting at is that I'm half Belgian. So I grew up in Virginia on the East Coast, but my mother was Belgian, and I went back and forth, not every summer, but probably every other summer, to spend time with my Belgian grandparents. And in those days, the flight was expensive. You wouldn't just go for a week. I would go for 6 weeks or so, and really defined myself as half European. I mean, there was this completely different culture where they spoke French and they ate dinner in the middle of the day and they drank wine and with dinner, and they lived in the city, and it was a completely different world than peanut butter and jelly sandwiches in the suburbs. And so when I was 30, I went on the law teaching market. And until that time, I'd never been west of the Mississippi. I'd spent one summer in Indiana, and other than that, I'd never been off the East Coast. And so I came to California. I came to LA. I interviewed at UCLA and at USC and then at Stanford, and was just bowled over really by California, if you can imagine seeing it for the very first time at age 30. And I will say that I might well have chosen to make my career there, but as it happened, my best law teaching offer was at the University of Chicago, and so off I went to Chicago. But I've sent you my son instead. My son is in LA and has no interest in returning to the East Coast. So I think you can count on, once we're traveling again, on my coming out to see him.
Thank you. I want to just make one comment on national security. In this conversation today, we're going to define it very, very broadly. I know Secretary of Defense Gates has said, national security really starts with the economy. Without a strong economy, that you can't have strong deterrence around the world of others who are considering transgressions, and you can't have a well-equipped, well-trained military without a strong economy. And we all know today, with the shrinking of our gross national product, that we have a lien on that strong economy, a big one, that is this COVID-19 virus. So we're going to be defining national security very broadly in this conversation today. But you're president and chief executive officer of New America. What is New America? What's it trying to do? And what's involved in your day-to-day life there?
So New America is a think and action tank. Really what that means is we're an organization dedicated to trying to address big public problems. Our distinctive mission is that we are dedicated to renewing the promise of America by holding the country to its highest ideals, particularly in an age of rapid technological and social change. So that means a number of things. It means we focus on big, bold ideas. We're thinking now about what should America look like on its 250th anniversary in 2026. We're thinking about how to overhaul the entire higher education system. I would say the entire education system, from cradle all the way through, or how to have a radically different relationship between work and life, or what is the future of work and labor power. How do we overhaul our democracy so that we're actually represented? And how do we show up in the world consistent with our values while also defending our security? So those are our areas of work. Our mission, as I said, is really to think about renewing the promise of America. And we work in lots of different ways, from think tank reports, like many of you have read, to actually working directly with state and local governments to figure out where the problems are in delivering policy, and in something that we call public interest technology. It's an elephant. Depending what part of it you touch, you get something different, but it's a very exciting community of wonderful people. And we are very proud to claim you as a board member.
Word on the street has it that you've teamed up with an institution that really is west of the Mississippi, Arizona State University, in a future security forum that I think is about to start or maybe going on right now. Tell us about what that is and what objective are you trying to achieve with that partnership with ASU in that forum?
So we do indeed have a strong partnership with ASU. ASU calls itself the New American University, and Michael Crow, its president, loves the connection between that and the New American University and New America. 7 years ago, we started something called the Joint Center on the Future of War, and actually created a global master's online in global security. And you're quite right, the Future Security Forum is going on now, and I encourage everyone after this conversation to join it. We just opened it up. But what we're trying to do is really, again, not just look at policy, defense policy or foreign policy, but what are the big changes? So one of our senior fellows, Peter Singer, specializes in writing novels that he bases on present sources. So he wrote one about a war between the United States and China called Ghost Fleet, where every single thing that happens in the novel, and it's a kind of futuristic novel, you can trace to either a Chinese or American public, they're not open source, but public defense documents. And now he's written one called Burn In about essentially human robot interaction and imagining our security going forward in a world of robots and really advanced artificial intelligence. That requires us to think about our security and how we spend our defense dollars and whom we recruit and how we train our military, our security forces much more broadly, very, very differently. And so the Future Security Forum looks at everything from future weapons, also to global threats like the pandemic or climate change. I mean, what California is experiencing right now is certainly as much of a threat to the security of Californians and indeed to Americans as somebody threatening a nuclear strike. I mean, you can devastate the state just as much. So how do we integrate that? And then how do we think about things like proxy wars and hybrid war? And also how are we going to reflect the diversity of the country we are in our armed forces?
You should be proud. If my memory is correct, Peter Singer was a student of yours. And
He was.
in his career, professional career, and he's done quite well. I know he did spend a number of years at Brookings, and you managed to lure him away from Brookings to New America. So very interesting. You have been dean of what was the Woodrow Wilson School of Public Affairs. It's taken the name Woodrow Wilson off that school. There is a Woodrow Wilson Center in the Smithsonian, and it has left the name Woodrow Wilson on that center. Tell us a little bit about what happened in the removal of that name, why that was done, and why you think about that, what you think about that, and what you think about ought to be done at the Woodrow Wilson Center in the Smithsonian.
Not easy questions, but very important ones, and ones that really strike at the heart of many of the really tough debates that this country is having as we reckon with our history. And again, I said before, 2026 is our 250th anniversary as a nation. Obviously, the land was here well before. It is also the anniversary where we are on the cusp of being a majority white nation to being a plurality nation. And indeed, by 2027, a majority that will already be true of all Americans under 30. In other words, that there will be no majority if you look at Americans under 30. And by 2045, it will be true of the whole country. And I start there because America is changing. America has changed from the moment it was founded through immigrants. Even when it was simply Anglo-Saxon immigrants, there were many, many different people than the founders expected. And then, of course, we have consistently changed who we are, and we're still doing that. But of course, as we represent Americans more fairly, and as the we is more diverse and is able to actually examine our history. People have different views of our history. So to get to your specific question, in 2016, when the question of renaming the Woodrow Wilson School came up, Princeton's board looked at it with a board commission, and they decided that Woodrow Wilson had been essential to making Princeton a great university. He really took it from what some people call the finest country club in the land and made it an intellectually serious institution. He had been president. He'd coined the informal motto of Princeton, Princeton in the nation's service, and he was one of 2 presidents to be an alum. They decided not to change the name, and I agreed as a former dean of the school with that decision. But this year, after George Floyd was murdered, I think many of us felt that we couldn't continue as we'd been going. And indeed, there's a sculpture outside the school that has quotes from Woodrow Wilson, but also has quotes from many other Americans, including one from William E.B. Du Bois, who wrote The Souls of Black Folk and was a great leading intellectual of his time. And he writes, you know, Mr. President, all my people want is a chance to live in dignity, security, and prosperity. That was written in 1913. And for me, reading it and realizing we're 2020 and African Americans are still not really being allowed to live their lives in dignity, security, and prosperity, I think there was a broad sense that we have to listen harder and we have to give up things even when they matter to us. And changing the name of the school is hard for a lot of Princetonians. My father was a major in the school. I was. It was sort of part of our identity. But if you ask yourself, if Princeton were run by African Americans or indeed many people of color, would they ask students to venerate a man who is on the name of a school of public and international affairs, who resegregated the federal civil service, and who, yes, he was a man of his time, but he actually was more racist than some members of his time? And even so, it's a question of how you balance the good things he did versus the bad things. I came out thinking this is the right thing to do, but that doesn't mean, to go to your other part of your question, that we erase Woodrow Wilson from history. He did do many good things. He did many good things for white Americans, often at the expense of Black Americans, but so did Franklin Delano Roosevelt. That was the trade-off to get Southern senators on board when you passed progressive legislation like Social Security or unemployment insurance. You cut out occupations that were mostly people of color. That doesn't mean we don't recognize that he did good things. He was a complicated man, but he was a man of tremendous force and leadership. So it depends when and where you choose still to bear his name. I'm pretty certain that the Woodrow Wilson Center is probably named that way by legislation. And he was president of the United States, and of course he created the liberal international order. So I wouldn't make that judgment for other people, but I would say as a Princetonian, I'm proud that Princeton responded in a small way, and it has a much bigger things it has to do by no longer asking students of public and international affairs to study in a school bearing his name.
You know, I grew up in the South, in North Carolina, in a small rural town in the 1950s. We had a much different life there than I do currently in Los Angeles. We've had recently a lot of renaming of streets and a lot of removing of statues along the same lines that you've been talking about the Woodrow Wilson name on the school at Princeton. I want to ask you a question. I worry a little bit about some of that because I think we can get in a mindset so much that, look, we've renamed this school, we've renamed this entity, we've renamed this street, we've taken down this statue, it's no longer standing there. We've done our we've done our duty, we've done our things, and we're off to other things. And to what extent can those kinds of activities be an excuse for what I think is more, not doing what I think is more important, is re-examining ourselves and our own structures and our own minds and how we relate and think about things. Is it a crutch? Does it get us off the job of turning inwards and trying to assess those questions about us personally, or not? Or do you worry about that?
Well, these are hard questions. And as you know, I grew up in Charlottesville, Virginia. And of course, Thomas Jefferson founded the University of Virginia. And Jefferson, I mean, my goodness, if you took Jefferson off everything that is named for him in Charlottesville, from banks to streets to everything else, you'd rename half the town. So it's complicated. I don't think it's complicated when it comes to Civil War heroes. Of course, in the South, we would have called it war between the states, or indeed, even earlier time, the War of Northern Aggression. I mean, the fact is, the South seceded, the North won. Secession was regarded as treason. It was the secession. Yes, you can talk about states' rights, but it certainly was to preserve the Southern way of life, which absolutely depended on enslaved Black people. And there, I think you can just say it's high time that actually, the Union gets to determine the narrative. It's more complicated with earlier American presidents, statesmen, et cetera, who were people of their times, and they were slaveholders. But there too, I think it's only a symbol, to your point. It can never be an excuse for not doing more. But I think it's very important to listen to the African Americans who say, look, this symbol matters to me. And certainly as a woman, I know that it matters to see a portrait of a woman on the walls of the Harvard Law School. When I first got there in 1982, there was one woman on the wall. So you basically were being told on a daily basis, white men are lawyers and judges. Anybody else, you don't fit. Symbols matter. And I think it's about power. If this country were run by a government that completely reflected the population of the country, many of those people would have very different views about whom they wanted to honor and whom they didn't. And so we have to listen and hear, and then say, okay, we're gonna start with trying to find a historical narrative that reflects us all. But then that can never be that's the point of departure, not the destination. But I do think if it matters enough for people to ask for that to be changed, then it matters enough for us to listen hard and say, maybe it's time to change.
Back in 1925, the diplomatic service and the consular service were combined into a new department, was named the Department of State, which has been serving us for 95 years. We have, in December 2016 through March of 2018, we lost 1,200 positions in the Department of State. Why did that happen? And what is happening? And how do you view the modern day State Department versus the needs as we move into the next decade or two? And particularly with the fact that we have a changing workforce. When I grew up in North Carolina, and we went to college, we all looked at maybe joining a company and working for that company for 30 years and then retiring in the same company. But our world doesn't work that way anymore. We're in much shorter chunks of service to various employers or various entities. So how do you consider that mix, and how do you explain the loss of positions in the State Department, and what does that mean about what we should be trying to do as we move into the next decade or two with that department?
Wow. It's a very important question. And before I answer it, I do just want to say, as we're moving sort of closer to traditional national security subjects, that I do think how we address racial justice right now is not only critical for our strength and well-being and prosperity as a country at home, the world is also watching. The world is really watching as to whether or not we have the courage to recognize our own hypocrisy and rectify it as much as we can. And if we can, I think then the world draws one judgment. If we cannot, then our proclamations of universal values ring hollow. So I say that, and then coming to the State Department, so I've just written an article in Democracy Journal, which I know you also support, calling for a radical overhaul of the Foreign Service. As you point out, it was created in 1925. We're 2020. And it assumes that people have 30-year careers and that they go into the State Department and they spend 2 years stamping visas, and then they start 3-year tours all over the world, and they gradually work their way up until sort of the last decade when they have a shot at being an ambassador. And I really think, as you said, that is not how careers work anymore. I think we need what I call a global service, where people would sign up for 5 to 7 year tours of duty that would be renewable at least once. But what that would mean is that somebody like you, Bob, who, you start your career in business, but you have tremendous interest in foreign policy, at age 40 or at age 50, you could have signed up to be a diplomat. And yes, you'd have to go through training, but there are people in every walk of American life who travel enormously and speak other languages and know other cultures, whether they're in the civic sector or the private sector, or indeed in state government, mayor's offices. There in Los Angeles, you have a fabulous deputy mayor for international affairs who used to be the ambassador to ASEAN. So the idea is that America has a tremendous wealth of global talent. Kids who grew up speaking their family's language, who are immigrants, again, people who are learned and who travel, and that the State Department forces you to choose to represent your country once at the outset, relative outset of your career. You can go in your 30s, but people don't tend to go in after that. And that's just an artifact of another era. And there's no reason you can't go in for 2 years. I think you have to go in for at least 5, and maybe it's 7. But just imagine if people could rotate in and out at any point in their career for, as I said, renewable tours of duty. And the other thing this would do is that if you've been in the private sector or the civic sector, you have a different Rolodex. And most of the problems we face today, whether it, again, climate change, pandemics, cybersecurity, resource scarcity, water scarcity, poverty, even terrorism, global crime, most of those issues require tri-sector solutions. Government can do a lot, but you need business at the table. Think about a vaccine right now. You're never going to get that without business at the table, without universities at the table, with civic sector, figuring out equitable distribution, governments, international organizations. And we need people representing us who've got a friend in every different sector and knows who to call and knows how to bring them together.
I want to backtrack for just a second, or maybe a minute. You had talked about the Future Security Forum with Arizona State University going on right now, and you sort of gave an invitation to our listeners today to join. How would they go about that mechanistically, of actually becoming a part of that? What do they have to do?
I think if you go on the New America website, you should see it on the home page and just click on. But if it isn't on the home page, it is certainly under the International Security Program. And again, it's open to all. So you will just see the little square that says Future Security Forum, and you can click on and watch. I know later this afternoon, General Votel and Michelle Flournoy are in conversation with one another. We always have some of our senior most military leaders, as well as a whole array of foreign policy and defense experts.
Let's segue back to the State Department. We've seen in the last couple of decades a tremendous change in technology. And some of that's available to us to use in our day-to-day business and social relations. Talk to us a little bit about to what extent the State Department uses that technology and to what extent you think maybe it ought to move forward and make more use of technology in doing its job more effectively.
And well, every embassy can now be a Zoom room. It's, as you think about it, you don't need cables anymore. I also realize I didn't answer your question about why so many people have left the State Department. I think that it is a highly demoralized institution at the moment because President Trump has made clear he does not respect the State Department, and you've had two secretaries of state, one of whom actively encouraged people to leave, and another who, by the lights of many diplomats, is not reflecting the values of the service. I don't condone that in the least. I do think the service needs to be remade. I just wouldn't go about it this way. But on technology, this is again where we are a great country. We are a wealthy country. We are one of the most advanced technological countries in the world, although if you compare us to Estonia or many countries actually in Europe and some in Africa, we're not, our government is way behind, except for the military, in using technology. When I joined the State Department in 2009, I was handed a Dell computer that was circa 1999. It was at least 10 years old. It took so long to boot up and to try to get onto the State Department systems that I immediately gave up and went back to my own laptop, as did everyone, which of course has security implications, although I was quite confident that Princeton University had strong security. And just to make clear, none of this was classified. You wouldn't, and you actually cannot plug into a classified system outside the State Department unless you have a very special room set up. But the internal technology is terrible and slows people up. For instance, there's no way if I have a project, say on agriculture in the Middle East, and I'm trying to support a State Department initiative, there's no way to find out who even in the State Department knows something about that, much less the rest of government. But we also don't use technology well to actually engage people around the world. When President Obama gave his speech, A New Beginning with the Muslim World, we were using radios in many places. Now, some of that was the technology of the places we were, but some of it was simply that we had not thought in the way California would certainly think, what does this technology enable us to do in terms of reaching people directly and engaging them and teach and really allowing them to know the United States in so many ways, or getting our views across. So we need a pretty wholesale technological overhaul. Again, the Pentagon has pretty spectacular technology, but state and USAID and many other US agencies do not.
You have a husband who is in his own right a political scientist and specialist in international relations. And the two of you together have two boys, Alex and Michael. I want you to tell us why women can't have it all, why women can't have it all, the difficulties women have in fulfilling a career and balancing that with family life.
Well, now, Bob, the title of the article I wrote in 2012 was Why Women Still Can't Have It All. So it was never intended to say that women can't have it all. It was intended to say that we are still a long way from having the kind of society that really allows women to have an equal shot with men at having a career and a family. That once you have children, child rearing, child care still falls disproportionately on women, vastly disproportionately, although there are plenty of men out there, and there are plenty of single fathers, there are plenty of single sex couples, men and women who are raising children. So this is not in the least to say that men shouldn't or don't raise children, but it is to say that the distribution of obligation is still very lopsided, and that our workplaces make it extremely difficult for women to work, or men, I would say, for caregivers to work flexibly. Now, it's interesting thinking about all this at a moment when all of us are at home, and I'm at home right now, talking to you at home, talking to an audience who are sitting at home. So we've now demonstrated to many, many managers and bosses what many caregivers have been saying for a long time, which is, of course, I can get my work done at home. That is true. On the other hand, children are at home too, and women are, again, disproportionately working with them on their education, taking care of them. And so it's effectively saying to women, it's not a fair competition. You are doing two jobs, and the men you're competing with are doing one, or maybe 1.25, maybe 1.5. And so until we change that, until we have the same expectations of men at home as we do of women in the office, until we change the way we think of the arc of career to make room for caregiving in various ways. Of course, there's some women that are going to succeed, and I said in my article, they're self-employed, superhuman, or very wealthy, where they can just buy the help they need. Of course, some women can do it, but overall, and we of course see this in the numbers, you have an equal number of men and women coming out of school. Indeed, you have more women coming out of college and equally in graduate school. But 20, 30 years on, you're back down to 20% women, 10% women, 5% women in senior jobs. So it was not a statement about women not being able to have it all. It was a statement about what society still needs to do, I think, to integrate care and career.
Thank you. Just recently, Attorney General William Barr has announced a new policy of the Justice Department and the federal government, designating New York City and Seattle and Portland as jurisdictions permitting violence and destruction of property. And he's begun, along with other executives of the federal branch, to defund programs that normally would be funded to those three cities, New York City, Seattle, and Portland, until they demonstrate to the federal government that they are no longer, in their opinion and words, permitting violence and destruction of property as a matter of policy. What are your thoughts about that arena and what's happening there?
Well, I think it is a pretty transparently political move in an election year. You've got 3 cities that are blue cities, and you've got a red government, and it is a way of highlighting protests that have, yes, turned violent certainly in some cases. And I absolutely think the cities must get that under control. But I also think if you look at all the protests in all 3 cities, the nonviolent protests vastly, vastly outweighs the incidences of violence. And I also believe mayors have the greatest incentive to get it under control, because mayors are the ones on the scene and their constituents are the ones suffering. So that you really do need to let mayors lead here. I think, though, there's an even bigger issue at stake, which worries me deeply, which is the distribution of population, red and blue, urban versus rural. Because if you look at a map of the United States, Democrats are much more concentrated in the cities and Republicans much more in rural areas, and we fight over the suburbs. But that has all sorts of pernicious implications for state legislatures fighting mayors and city council, because state legislatures can pass preemption laws that block cities, say, from paying a living wage. And that to me is a real problem, mostly because of just the idea of local control. I mean, obviously, we have a federal constitution, we have things that apply to everyone, and you can't just opt out. But we also have a country in which things like police or schools or sales taxes, those have been left up to people governing themselves within a small town, within an agricultural community, or within a city. And exacerbating the hideous polarization of our politics along urban-rural lines really does not serve any of us well.
I had planned now to get into a discussion of COVID. We're running out of time, so I'm not going to do that. I just note for everybody's information that we haven't quite yet hit the 200,000 death mark. We are at 199,636 as of the count of about a half an hour ago. So we're close, but we haven't gone there. So I'm going to turn the program back over to Jessica, who's standing by with a number of excellent questions from our listeners and fellow members of Town Hall and the Council. So Jessica, thank you for the good work you've been doing all along. You've really been the key to having all these programs, successful programs, and all of us appreciate what you've done.
Thank you so much, Bob, and thank you for helping us to bring these great speakers to the Council in the last week. Yes, we have a lot of questions coming in, so I'll get right to those. Dr. Slaughter, to what extent do we need to engage globally in order to enhance our safety and security in this pandemic world?
Right, and I'll try to keep my answers short so we can get to lots of questions. And Bob, that number to almost 200,000 is more Americans than have died in all wars combined since the Korean War, just to set that in context. To the question, the United States needs to re-engage the world because the threats that we face of all kinds require partnership, allyship, and indeed even cooperation with rivals. We'll never defeat climate change if we're not cooperating, or even mitigate climate change if we're not cooperating with China. So it's really not a choice about America first and taking care of our own security alone. We must cooperate with other nations. And right now, we are doing everything we can to alienate them. The next president is going to have to spend a lot of time repairing relations and reassuring other countries that we will not simply turn on them again.
Thank you so much. In the last few years, the Department of Defense and Congressional Commission have supported maintaining the Selective Service System as a national security human resource insurance policy. Both also suggested additional improvements, such as including young women in the registration process. Do you support these two basic policy proposals?
I do, and I would support young women, adding young women for sure. I would really much prefer a system of national service overall, where it would be mandatory for young people and volunteer for anybody else, or simply strongly encouraged, whereby you could do your national service in the military and you would have a volunteer force. That's something that I think the military would prefer. But you could do it in national parks, you could do it in community care, you could be building infrastructure. There are so many needs in this country, and what I strongly support is the idea that Americans need places where we come together in a common purpose, independent of our politics or our background.
Thank you. And this is a follow-up question to Bob's remark about the 200,000. The Department of Defense has spent much money, effort, and planning on biological warfare. The USA has lost 200,000 plus to COVID-19. Is this how national security priorities work? Did anybody at the Department of Defense tell the president he needed a better response, then quit to make it public, or did they just salute and turn their backs on US citizens?
Oh dear. Well, I think what I will say is I think there are many people in the government, including in the CDC, including in the military, who really have tried to be heard, who are patriots, who are serving the country as best they know how. This is not a White House that wants to listen to expertise. And so you could have the best talent in the world on pandemics, but if nobody's listening, it doesn't help you, including the military. And if you read General Mattis's memoirs, he's very, he's an old school general, and he doesn't want to criticize, but he's basically telling you that he wasn't listened to. So I think it's not that we didn't try, or that many people didn't try. It is that they did not want to be heard, and we are paying a terrible, terrible price, because had we acted the way South Korea reacted in January and pulled together personal protective equipment and enough tests, we really could have stopped this early on.
Thank you. This next question says, hello, my name is Amanda Wilson, and I am a Borgen Project Ambassador. To what extent do you feel that improving foreign aid and the international affairs budget can improve our national security, especially in the post-pandemic world?
That's a great question. I think the first thing I'd say is I don't think we should call it foreign aid anymore. And indeed, we need to overhaul the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, which is the act that governs USAID and all the ways we give foreign assistance. I think we're better off now recognizing that we are in a deeply interdependent world, and so investments we make in the health of other countries, in allowing them to mitigate climate change, because that's actually directly connected to health, in biodiversity, in combating poverty, in education, in women's rights. Those are investments that benefit them, but benefit us as well. One of the things we know about care and investment in others is that it works much better when it's mutual, when you don't create relationships of dependence and resentment. So I would certainly increase the budget for global health expenditures, education, again, countering poverty, fighting terrorism, but I don't think I'd do it as foreign aid. I would do it as these are the ways we build up our own security and our own prosperity by investing in others.
Thank you. Why have foreign assistance programs gone astray?
Well, so there's many reasons probably as there are foreign assistance programs. And of course, many of our foreign assistance programs actually end up spending money on US corporations. So if you're looking at food aid, for instance, there are all sorts of regulations that require us to provide American-made goods as assistance abroad. And you can imagine why some of those don't work. They're not necessarily what people want, or they're not building up independence in the country. But I think there are many other reasons. I do think that the United States over my lifetime has been humbled, and in some good ways, humbled by the recognition of just how hard it is to try to export our values, or just how hard it is to come into another country and make a difference. Which isn't to say we haven't done some very, very good things. There are many girls going to school around the world. There are definitely people who can point to US assistance in disasters or in sort of on longer term big problems. But I do think development as a discipline, we're coming to understand, again, it's not the US helping other poor countries. We have plenty of poor cities and rural areas right in this country. It's a question of how do you help people help themselves? And there are as many lessons probably from the Central Valley in California as there are from Central Africa.
Thank you. How can we do a better job in taking advantage of the intellectual capital locked in our ghettos? Do we need this advantage?
Yes, that's a great question. And yes, we do. The one thing we know in this century is that talent is at an absolute premium, particularly in a world that will be increasingly sophisticated technologically, but will also place a real premium on creativity and initiative. And we have so much talent that we are not using. If you believe, as I do, that talent is distributed equally, but opportunity is not, and that's just the bell curve across all human populations, then you have to figure in every poor community in the United States, in every group of kids who aren't educated properly, we are leaving talent on the table. So it is really in all of our interest. If we want a thriving economy, if we want to continue innovation, if we want to be the country that has the ability to take care of one another that we ought to be, we must unlock that talent. And that's really the way we ought to think about fighting racism and fighting systemic injustice.
Thank you. What kind of U.S. leadership will be required to facilitate the rethinking that you have discussed? That's a big question.
I mean, I really do think if we think about this over a decade or so, because this is our slide in the world is not just Donald Trump. It really has been coming in various ways through George W. Bush, even through Obama. Who had, we've pulled back because that's sort of where the American people have been, and certainly in the last 4 years. I think we need a new generation in power. It may not November, not necessarily, but certainly in this decade, and a far, far more diverse government and leadership. When you look at the New York Times faces of power, 80% are still white men. And we've got to change that. It's got to be 50-50 gender, race, creed, color, sexual orientation, you name it. And that way, I think we will get lots of new ideas. In fact, we just did a panel at the Future Security Forum on diversity and national security, where people see global issues differently and think of different ways to address them. So we really do need, I think, a generational change very soon.
Thank you. How does a possible next President Biden provide existential educational awareness to all American citizens in a cost-effective manner about the increasing realities of climate change as a national security threat to the nation?
Yeah, I mean, President Biden has to start with just plain healing, and I think he will. I think he will. If he's elected, he has got to take the temperature of our rhetoric down. He has to preach unity rather than division. He has to stop, taking every wedge issue that he can, which of course social media amplifies in such horrific ways. And then he needs to talk really soberly about what is happening. And even if he wants to say, look, it may not be wholly man-made. There's evidence of fluctuations. It's certainly aggravated. And even if this doesn't stop it, it's at least something we can do. But I think even beyond that, Americans have to see switching to clean energy as a huge opportunity for jobs, for retrofitting, for construction, for just better life, cleaner life, cheaper life. And that's what's been missing is, for the doom and the gloom and the apocalypse that people in LA with red skies and smoky air have been seeing, that doesn't motivate people. I mean, that scares people, but it doesn't motivate people to see a better future. So I think he really has to outline that future and show people how to get there rather than just harping on how we fight approaching doom.
Thank you. I'm curious to know Dr. Slaughter's opinion on U.S. ambassadors that are career diplomats versus those that are political appointees. From her experience, has she found that one group has a significant advantage over the other?
Well, I have seen great political appointees and great Foreign Service officers. I'm not sure that I can say that there is a decisive advantage for one over the other. I've also seen some less than great political appointees and Foreign Service officers. But again, I would really obliterate that distinction by having this very different vision of a global service. And I do think probably it would make sense, particularly if you had people who could rotate in for 5 to 7 year tours of duty, to then dramatically diminish, if not end, the practice of using ambassadorships as rewards for big donors. I don't think that does a lot for us in the world. Again, there are some who have been spectacular, but sort of telling that other country, you know, we're not going to send someone who has spent a lot of time studying your country and figuring out, you know, really dedicated to foreign affairs. We're going to send somebody who is a friend of the president's. That may have its own advantages, but it seems to me that subject at least should be ripe for re-examination in the context of a real overhaul of whom we send abroad.
Yeah, thank you. In the next few years, will China try to bring Taiwan more under its control like Hong Kong? How does the US help maintain the current status quo?
That is a very, very important issue. And one of the things that should keep us all awake at night is the fear that China is going to underestimate our resolve to defend Taiwan and to do something that we then respond to, and then we're on the brink of war with China, which nobody wants, certainly not Taiwan. So I do think that China has used this moment of pandemic and preoccupation and US gross political dysfunction to take measures against the Uyghurs and to tighten its control of Hong Kong. I think if Xi Jinping could, in fact, bring Taiwan back into the fold, I mean, it's one China, but Taiwan and China each have a different view about which China that is. They might well try. So I think the best thing the United States can do, and Michelle Flournoy has a wonderful article on Foreign Affairs really outlining specific measures of deterrence, is to be very, very clear about what China can expect, to make clear that we are determined to live up to our treaty obligations, to be present, and to avoid confusing signals.
Thank you so much. Going back to the question about women having it all, do we get it wrong when we discuss women having it all? Should we instead talk about men and women having it all during the course of their lives rather than throughout their lives?
Yes, we should. And indeed, I do not use the term having it all anymore. After I wrote the article in 2012, Rebecca Traister wrote a great piece that pointed out that having it all really came from Helen Gurley Brown of Cosmo. It was not a feminist idea. It was a kind of commercial idea. And I think at a time when so many people have so little, it is not right for any of us to talk about having it all. We should talk about having enough. And we should be, many of us, I think, certainly including me, should be grateful. But I think to your point about being able to have a rich life that includes work and family, that should be a path open to men and women in whatever form of family they choose or don't choose. Not everybody wants to have children, but to the extent they do, then it does have to be over a lifetime. People can have a life expectancy of 70 or 80. Child rearing is at most 20 of those years. And of course, within that, you have more or less time, depending on where they are. And it is perfectly possible to design systems of work or how we think about the progression of a career that allows people to slow down in their 30s and 40s and ramp back up when they're ready. And honestly, it's better, because if you stop at 65, I'm looking at Bob, who's going, never not worked in some way or another. And my father retired at 87. Many of us don't have any intention of hanging up our shoes at 65 and saying that's that. Many of us would rather do different things, but still at a very high level of productivity. So I think that's the right way to think about it.
Thank you. And this will be our final question. And on the topic of people accomplishing great things throughout the course of their life, how did Justice Ginsburg's work influence your life and perspectives?
Well, she was an inspiration. I knew her not well at all, but as I knew her before she became a justice, when she was still a judge, and then of course as a justice. But she was legendary to anybody who went to law school in the 80s, as I did, because she was one of the great heroes of public interest law. So you think about Thurgood Marshall and all the lawyers who worked with him for African Americans, bringing a whole stream of cases, Brown v. Board of Education, but many others. And you thought of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and many other women with her, systematically building the case for gender equality. And I would say in particular, I'm a kind of big thinker. I like bold ideas. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was meticulous and careful and incremental, right? She didn't go for the big precedent because she knew you could lose it. And if you lost it, you were setting people back. She was very careful. She built her cases one on top of the other. And that has been a real inspiration for folks litigating marriage equality or any of the victories for disabled Americans, many different categories of public interest litigation.
Thank you so much. That was a rapid fire question session. So thank you so much, Dr. Slaughter. And Bob, I'm going to turn the conversation back over to you. Thank you.
It's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you very much, Anne Marie, for being with us, and we appreciate everything you've done for all of us in your hardworking career and are continuing to do day in and day out. Just wanted to add a footnote that we are now up to 199,660. So we're still about 340 deaths short of that big 200,000 number. There's an irony. Taiwan with 23 million has had 7 deaths. Yeah. Extrapolated to the U.S.'s 330 million, it would be a little less than 100. But we'll go into that at another day. I want to turn it back over to Kim.
Thank you, Bob. I enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you both just for such an excellent and informative discussion. And we so appreciate, Dr. Slaughter, your expertise and your time with us today. Thank you so very much. And for our viewers, if you want these quality programs to continue, please do us a favor and text the word GIVE, G-I-V-E, to the number on the screen. And every bit helps to keep these quality programs going. We can't do it without your support. We have a terrific lineup of programs. Tomorrow, we have Jill Lepore, who is a professor of American history at Harvard University. This is a partnered program with Writer's Block, moderated by politics professor Dan Schnur. And then on Wednesday, the impact of China's rise on Southeast Asia. This is a conversation with Sebastian Strangio, who's a journalist, author, and analyst on Southeast Asia, with Professor Donald Emerson, who's director of Southeast Asia, the Southeast Asia Forum at Stanford. And then, of course, we have on September 29th, California Secretary of State Alex Padilla. So please go to our website at lawac.org and register for those programs today and sign up and to become a member and make a donation. And please, everybody, stay safe and stay informed, and we hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you again, Dr. Slaughter. Bob, magnificent as always. Thank you.